We're coming on the air tonight with moving pieces in Georgia, where just within the last few minutes, a federal judge rejected the terms of a plea deal for two of the men who murdered Ahmaud Arbery. But could they still face a federal hate crimes trial? One thing's for sure, Arbery's parents want him to. And in a minute, you're going to hear the very real reaction from a family who says any sort of deal gives her son's killers one last chance to spit in her face. Plus, also out of Georgia, why a prosecutor investigating former President Trump's alleged election interference says she needs FBI protection because of the ex-president's own words. And no war on the ground yet, but a war of words, that is totally happening, with the U.S. saying one thing, Russia saying another, and Ukraine basically begging everybody to calm down. We've got the fireworks at a UN meeting. Plus, are you into the crypto craze or going crazy trying to figure it out? Why one well-known economist calls it downright dangerous, with some people hitting the jackpot and others investing in crypto getting jack squat. And Joe Rogan saying, look, he wasn't trying to spread lies about COVID. He was just, asking questions. But is that enough to stop artists from abandoning Spotify? We'll talk about what the company's doing now later in the show. Let's start down in Georgia, where something unexpected is happening as we speak. We said it a second ago. A judge has come on and rejected a federal plea deal for the convicted killers of Ahmaud Arbery. It happened after we woke up today to fury from Arbery's parents when they found out federal prosecutors had negotiated this deal with their son's murderers. You'll remember both Gregory and Travis McMichael were convicted on state charges of murdering Arbery while he was jogging through a neighborhood in Brunswick, Georgia. We talked a lot about that trial. We had coverage of it here on the show. They were sentenced to life in prison earlier this month. But here's the thing. They also faced federal hate crime charges, and that's what we're talking about with this deal. Prosecutors tried to get them to plead guilty to attacking Arbery because of his race. Why would the McMichaels have done that? Well, the deal would have had them serve part of their sentence, 30 years, in a federal prison, not a more notorious Georgia state prison. Arbery's mother said to the judge that granting these men their preferred conditions of confinement would defeat her, saying, quote, it gives them one last chance to spit in my face after murdering my son. Blaine Alexander joins us now. So, Blaine, I know this is really fast moving. We're talking literally in the last 20 minutes. A lot of this has unfolded here with the judge rejecting this deal. Everybody's kind of got to go back to the drawing board. What's the reaction so far since this decision was made by the judge from Arbery's family? Do we know?
Well, Hallie, we know that this has been a very emotional day for them. As you mentioned, they kind of woke up this morning essentially saying that they were angry that this deal had been struck, as Wanda Cooper-Jones, Ahmaud Arbery's mother, says, behind their backs, completely behind their backs. And since then, they have been putting out statements. They've spoken to other media outlets, and then finally they spoke in that federal courtroom before the judge, essentially saying, please listen to us, please reject this deal. We know now that the judge did exactly what they asked. The judge has rejected the terms of this plea agreement, and essentially this is a very short-term or short-lived, or at least for right now, a victory for the Arbery family. So I want to talk about why this is important, though. What we did see is that in exchange for essentially admitting that the events that led to the death of Ahmaud Arbery, the fact that this father and son duo, Gregory and Travis McMichael, chased after him and ultimately killed him, they would have to admit that that was racially motivated, and in exchange, they would be able to serve the first 30 years in federal prison. Now, here's why Wanda Cooper-Jones, Ahmaud Arbery's mother, was so against that. She says essentially that would give them a chance to be more comfortable, to be in a place that would be preferable, a federal prison over Georgia state prisons. And she says they don't deserve that. They don't deserve that sort of choice or that sort of preference. And that's why she was so much against this, Hallie.
But there's a disconnect here, right, Blaine? Because what we also heard in this hearing today was prosecutors, I believe, saying, hey, we thought that we were told by the lawyers, I believe, for the victims' family members that they would be okay with the plea deal. And the prosecutor, I think they went out of their way, the DOJ, to basically say, we don't blame the family here. Like, that's not what they're trying to do. But Blaine, clearly, the line of communication got messed up somewhere.
And that's why the story has been so confusing throughout the day. That's why these events throughout the day have been so confusing, because, you'll remember back in January, there was another possible deal on the table, and Arbery's parents said, no, we don't want that. We reject it. We don't want this at all. Now, it came out in court today that the federal prosecutor said, you know what? We got assurances from two different attorneys, the attorney for the mother and the father of Ahmaud Arbery, that the family would not fight this, would go along with this. That's clearly not the case here. So what we're waiting to see now, Hallie, I think this one other thing thing that did get lost in all of this, Travis McMichael, of course, the son in all of this, the one who pulled the trigger, did enter a plea, did plead guilty to that first count that essentially says that the actions were racially motivated. So now what we're waiting to see is whether or not that plea is going to stand. The judge, after rejecting the plea deal, then turned to the attorneys and said, you know what, we're going to take a 10-minute recess. I want you to then come back and decide if you want to keep that plea or if you want to withdraw it, go to trial. The judge or the attorneys came back and said, you know what, 10 minutes is a really short amount of time to make such a life-altering decision. Can we have a few more days? So that's why we're going to see them back in court on Friday, when we'll find out whether or not Gregory and Travis McMichael want to enter those guilty pleas or not. But again, this trial is slated to begin on Monday, Hallie.
It's a big deal, Blaine. I mean, I don't think I have to remind folks who are watching this program. We covered it so much. This was wall to wall, the trial, the closing statements, the sentencing, cable news, taking this wall to wall. People may remember, Blaine, and I say this to say this was part of the national conversation that happened over race, over justice in this country. And this case was among those that was, among the most high profile here. There was also a third person who people will remember, Roddy Bryan, people remember his name, I think, who was also convicted of killing Arbery, also charged in this federal hate crimes case. Not mentioned here, right? We haven't talked about him. Why not, right? He's the one who shot that video that was sort of everywhere here. Why was he not included in this, and what happens to his federal case?
Couple of differences here. One, he was sentenced in the state case. You'll remember he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The McMichaels were not. They get life without parole. He did not reach a plea deal, so he's not included in kind of this lump of plea deals here. But that is something, of course, that federal prosecutors are working for as well. I do want to mention this, though. You talked about how this has been such a long-standing story. I've covered this now for more than a year. I've spent a lot of time talking to Wanda Cooper Jones, Ahmaud's mother, and this has been such an emotional journey for her. But one thing that she said today that stood out to me in court is that she doesn't want to hear anything else from Travis or Gregory McMichael. She says, yes, I understand that this would be them admitting to the fact that this was racially motivated, but she says that doesn't comfort me. That doesn't mean anything to me. I don't want to hear anything else from them. I want them to get what she calls the sentence that they deserve, this life without prison, having to serve life in, as she said, a Georgia prison. She mentioned that it was important that it be a Georgia prison. She said, that's where I paid my taxes, that's where I raised my son, and most notably, that's where they killed my son. And so she said it was very important to her that she see them serve time in a state prison rather than federal prison.
Blaine Alexander, live first here in Atlanta with the latest twists and turns on this. Blaine, thank you. Let me bring in one of our legal experts, Danny Savallo. So, Danny, the prosecution does not have to take into account the family's wishes when figuring out some kind of plea deal, right? But the judge can certainly hear those victim statements, like what Blaine just talked about from Wanda Cooper Jones, Ahmaud Arbery's mother. The judge can certainly take that into account, as happened here, in deciding whether or not to reject the terms.
The Crime Victims' Rights Act allows, or I should say requires, that families of victims and victims be heard at critical hearings. That would be sentencing and the acceptance of a plea. Now, also, the judge has the power, under Rule 11 it's called, to reject a plea that he thinks is either too lenient or not in the public interest. And he or she can make that decision based on the voice of the crime victims. And the Crime Victims' Rights Act gave crime victims a louder voice, so to speak, at these proceedings so that the judge can take it into account. And every defendant is essentially warned when you enter into a plea agreement that, look, it's possible the judge could reject this. It doesn't happen often, but even when I enter into plea agreements for clients, I have that lingering concern always. What if the judge sees something wrong with this? Usually, though, it doesn't happen.
Because this is extraordinary, right? This is very unusual, Dan, and I think it's important to have that context here. What happens next? If this trial is supposed to start next week, as Blaine has reported, could they go back to the drawing board with a new plea? Do they go forward with the trial? Do we not know yet? Will we not know until Friday?
There's nothing to prevent them from going back to the drawing board, as you said. There's nothing to prevent a defendant from asking to plead straight up to the indictment without any plea agreement at all or any deal with the prosecution, with the government. They may just decide to plead to the indictment as it is and take their chances with a sentencing judge. But it seems like they're receptive. By that, I mean the defendants are receptive to a plea deal they may go back to the government and ask again. The one thing that victims and their families cannot do is order the government, the prosecutors, to accept or not accept a plea deal. At the end of the day, the prosecution is not the lawyers for the victims. The victims are not the clients. The prosecutors' clients, they would say, is all of us, the people writ large and the government of the United States. So although crime victims have a voice, they don't get to decide what happens in the prosecution.
Danny Savalos, thank you so much for that clear and concise explanation. We appreciate it. We're going to keep an eye on any developments out of that story, but we also want to hit that international tug of war now over what's actually going on at the Ukraine border, with top diplomats from the U.S. and Russia sniping at each other face to face about Moscow's military game plan. Check this out here. On the left, you're going to see the Russian ambassador today. That's him at a meeting of the United Nations Security Council. On the right, that is U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who had a very clear warning for the Russians. Watch.
If Russia further invades Ukraine, none of us will be able to say we didn't see it coming, and the consequences will be horrific.
So for its part, Russia says the U.S. is trying to, quote, whip up hysterics. They're accusing America of calling for this being a potential war. Obviously, the U.S. is doing the opposite. And make no mistake, this isn't something out of thin air. Check out this map. It shows the tanks and artillery popping up along Ukraine's border. You can see more and more and more of them. That's about 130,000 Russian soldiers waiting for any word from the Kremlin. And listen to this. We have new NBC News reporting that Russia is shipping blood to the front lines for its troops. Think about that. It's a bit of a gory illustration of how Russia is getting ready for fighting and for casualties. Right now, the focus is still on diplomacy, of course, but President Biden says the U.S. is prepped for anything.
We continue to urge diplomacy as the best way forward. But with Russia's continuing its buildup of its forces around Ukraine, we are ready no matter what happens.
We're going to get the view from overseas with our Matt Bodner in Moscow in just a second. But I want to start with Josh Letterman at the White House. So, Josh, we heard from the White House press secretary today confirmation that Russia is surging 5,000 more troops to the border with Ukraine. You know, there's a lot of focus on diplomacy. You've got Secretary of State Tony Blinken set to speak with Sergei Lavrov, his counterpart, tomorrow. But at some point, you know, when you look at the apparatus, the military apparatus on the ground, the question comes up, like, is diplomacy going to be enough here?
Well, it won't be enough if 100,000 Russian troops cross the Ukrainian border, right? I mean, that's really what we're talking about, because the Biden administration is trying to leave this diplomatic option open. They're trying to make very clear what the costs will be to President Putin and his economy if he does invade. But at the end of the day, the U.S. is not going to put troops in Ukraine. And President Biden has made that very clear, that there's not a military option here to deter Russia from entering Ukraine. And so at the end of the day, the ball is really in Putin's court here. And U.S. officials have been pretty candid, Hallie, about the fact that they don't exactly know what Putin is going to do. And that's why there's so much uncertainty now, even as these two countries are duking it out at the Security Council. You
also have what's happening a little bit down from where you are, just outside the White House on Capitol Hill, where I am, which is lawmakers, specifically the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, looking at creating this package that would include the mother of all sanctions, as it's been described, against Vladimir Putin. They're getting this, big deal classified briefing on Thursday, so they're sort of working on these different moving pieces until they hear more, right?
That's exactly right. And there's been some distance between some lawmakers and the White House in terms of, should we actually impose sanctions now, or should we wait until after President Putin has actually invaded? A lot of more hawkish senators in particular are saying, look, he's gone far enough already. There's no reason to hold off on punishing him now. But the White House feels like that would really take the whole point of the sanctions, which is to deter something from happening, off the table, because once the U.S. has already imposed sanctions that would hurt Russia's economy, at that point there's really less of a disincentive for Putin to just go ahead anyway and do what militarily he might want to do in Ukraine.
Josh, thank you so much for that reporting. Matt, let me go to you for the view from Russia, because what you just heard from Josh was this idea of maybe a bit of a disconnect between the White House and some members of Congress. There's also been this disconnect that we've talked about on this show with your colleagues and with you about the way that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people see what's happening, right, with the potential for war, and the way that the U.S. or the West sees it. You heard Russia today try to accuse, folks of getting whipped up into a hysteria about the potential that we are on the brink of war. What is it really like on the ground where you are?
So here in Moscow, Hallie, it just feels like normal life. Russians aren't really being told kind of the same story that we're telling, that we're hearing from the United States officials, from NATO itself. They're being told there's exercises on the ground, but they're not really getting the troop numbers. They're just not seeing it the same way we are. In fact, what they're being told is that Russia is conducting legitimate exercises on their territory. In the media, the Western media is hyping it up, possibly as a pretext for some kind of move on Russia, or as a way to kind of encourage Ukraine to go and attack eastern Ukraine, which of course is one of the things we kind of suspect Russia is looking for if it is trying to create a pretext.
There's also, listen, Vladimir Putin is somebody who, if he wants to be seen, he will be seen riding on a horse without a shirt on, playing hockey in a rigged game and winning, right? He knows how to put himself at the center of the picture here. We haven't heard from him in like 5 weeks. It clearly feels like a strategic move on his part to let the Russian military actions speak for themselves and keep people guessing about what's in his head.
Absolutely. Even without any kind of presence in this story at all, he's the center of attention. Right. Everyone is sitting here trying to guess his next moves. He's just kind of set up. He's built it up too. When he finally appears and comes out and tells us, where he's going to take this from here, he's kind of created this show around it, obviously with a very serious threat of force. But he also, I think, has left himself room to show up, say, okay, we're going to talk, we're going to hash out some deals and pull the troops back and kind of claim a win somehow. He has a lot of room to maneuver on that front, I think, and he can be the hero.
Matt Bodner, live for us there. Is that snow or rain behind you, Matt? Whatever it is, it's rather picturesque.
It's snow.
Appropriate. Matt Bodner, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm sure this is not the last we'll see of you this week from Russia. Back here at home in Washington, senators today are getting back to D.C. for the first time since Justice Stephen Breyer announced his retirement, with plenty to say as the list of potential replacements for him gets longer.
I think it's great to have this many qualified, extremely qualified people that can serve, and I think serve justice.
We have an opportunity to confirm another outstanding justice, one who will indeed champion the freedoms and liberties we hold so dear.
Just this afternoon, the White House says Senators Dick Durbin and Chuck Grassley, the chair and ranking member of the all-important Senate Judiciary Committee, will meet with President Biden tomorrow. And while there's no official shortlist at the moment, it's more like an informal 14 or so list. The White House has confirmed one name under consideration. That name is J. Michelle Childs. She's a district judge from South Carolina. We talked about her a little last week, although many names have been added since last week. But she's getting a ton of buzz, especially in the last couple days. Not just because the Jim Clyburns and Lindsey Grahams of the world are behind her, but also partly because she got her law degree not from the Harvards or the Yales or the other Ivy League schools, but from the University of South Carolina. We know she's on this list under consideration because the White House confirmed it. They basically said the nomination for her to the D.C. Circuit Court is on hold for now while she's up for consideration for this even bigger promotion. I want to bring in Leanne Caldwell. So, Leanne, even as we've been getting ready for the show, there have been some developments here as more senators get back from being out of town. Let me start first with this meeting tomorrow because, the Congress has an advise and consent role for President Biden, for any president picking a nominee. This is not unexpected that he would say, hey, top members of the Judiciary Committee, come here and let's talk about this.
No, it's absolutely not. And the fact, though, that he is bringing over both the top Democrat and the top Republican on the Judiciary Committee means that President Biden is serious about wanting to get bipartisan support for his nominee. He has said that he wants to talk to a range of people, Republicans and Democrats, and he's doing that. And he's starting with the most influential people in this process over in the Senate, the two people who are going to be running this process, Hallie.
You have the reaction. Let me talk about sort of the list here, right? Because we just showed, I couldn't count it quickly, but there's anywhere from 13 to 15, depending on what list you're looking at, of people that, not confirmed by the White House, you see it now, but based on our reporting here at NBC News, are under legitimate contention, right, under legitimate consideration for maybe being one of President Biden's picks here. One of those people is, of course, Judge Childs, Senator Graham, Senator Clyburn, back her. In fact, not Senator Clyburn, Congressman Clyburn. Here's what he told our own Garrett Haake just a little bit ago today.
I wish you would put her resume up against anybody's currently sitting on the Supreme Court and see what their resumes were at this time in their careers. They don't touch hers. And there are others in this group the same way.
And you talk about a president, Leanne, who wants to get bipartisan support. Senator Lindsey Graham backs her, too, partly because of her sort of public school experience. We got this stat, our team did, which I thought was interesting, that since the 1950s, more than 70% of justices have gone to Ivy League schools, right? Overwhelmingly Ivy. In fact, only one current justice did not go to an Ivy. That's Amy Coney Barrett, who went to Notre Dame.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the reasons, like you said, that Lindsey Graham is supportive of her. And that's why other senators are saying that she could be an interesting choice. And when they talk about diversity, they're talking not only about racial and gender diversity, but also diversity in schools of thought. And so this kind of working class state school background is really appealing to some of these members. And perhaps that can promote her extremely quickly, where she would skip the Court of Appeals and go right to the Supreme Court. But we'll see. The fact that there's already bipartisan suggestions that they would support her could maybe move her to the top of this list, Hallie.
There's also, you talk about the sort of diversity piece of this. It's really important to President Biden. He wants, and he has said, he will pick a black woman for this role. That is playing out in sort of a very different way on Capitol Hill. And in fact, we just heard from Senator Ted Cruz about this. He calls it an insult to black women and posted this video on his Twitter today.
Listen, Biden, the fact that he's willing to make a promise at the outset that it must be a black woman, I got to say that's offensive.
Right.
You know, black women are what, 6% of the U.S. population? He's saying to 94% of Americans, I don't give a damn about you.
I just want to say, Leanne, you know, my course of reporting on this and talking with people, I've spoken with black women who say it would actually be a monumental and generational move to put a black woman on the Supreme Court, who are looking forward, I think, to President Biden's decision there. What else are you hearing on the Hill on this front?
Yeah, I don't think people, black women, want Senator Ted Cruz to tell them what is offensive or not. But the Republican Party is split on this. Again, Lindsey Graham said that it's great, it's fine that President Biden has said that he's going to choose a black woman. Senator Roy Blunt, a member of leadership, just told our colleague Frank Thorpe that he was also fine with President Biden saying that he was going to nominate a black woman. And that's exactly something similar to what President Ronald Reagan did when he said he was going to nominate a woman to the Supreme Court, and also what Republicans up and down the spectrum in the Senate last year with Amy Coney Barrett, they praised the fact that she was a woman on the court. But this talk about it being a black woman and being offensive, that's also what we're hearing a lot on Fox News. And of course, Senator Ted Cruz is very close to what they say.
Leanne Caldwell, live for us on Capitol Hill. I feel like we're going to be talking for the next 60 to 90 plus days about this, probably more days than that. Leanne, thank you so much. I appreciate it. More on this report out of the UK about the parties that Boris Johnson had under lockdown. And it doesn't look like an apology is going to help the Prime Minister. Keir Simmons is here with what happens next. So you know that report we've been waiting for about Boris Johnson and his staff's parties during the COVID lockdown? It feels like we've been talking about it for weeks, because we have. Guess what? The report is finally out. Guess what? Part 2. It's not great for the British Prime Minister. I'm sure you're shocked. The government report says the parties were a, quote, serious failure to observe not just the high standards expected of those working in government, but also the standards expected of the entire British population. So the Prime Minister went to Parliament, tried to talk to them. They had a field day. Here's what happened.
I get it, and I will fix it.
He's insulted the public's intelligence.
This Prime Minister has lied and misled the House.
Man, Parliament gets rowdy. And this isn't even the whole story. 12 of the 16 parties the report looked at are still being investigated by the police. So they're getting in touch with partygoers to try to get their stories about what happened. Keir Simmons joins us now. Keir, loyal viewers of this show, of which there are many, will know that we've talked to you about Boris Johnson parties. We've talked to Matt Bradley in London about Boris Johnson's parties, right? Things where he was alleged to have shown up even at the height of lockdown when, for example, people couldn't go to funerals of loved ones, but yet there were still these social gatherings at Downing Street. Now this report is finally out. He's trying to avoid this no confidence vote. didn't seem like, Parliament had a ton of confidence in him based on some of the fireworks today. What's really going on here?
Hey, Hallie, yeah, well, look, I love that you say, I'm sure you're shocked that there were parties, because that is fundamentally what this report confirms. And I guess what is a pretty sensational conclusion is kind of a little bit lost simply because so many people ended up not really believing the Prime Minister. There were fireworks in the House of Commons. As you rightly say, it is a pretty explosive place at the best of times, but it doesn't get much more explosive than a former Prime Minister, Theresa May, standing up and accusing the current Prime Minister of incompetence. She said either you hadn't read the rules or you didn't understand them, or she suggested arrogance. She said you didn't think they applied to you. That is a damaging moment. Is it damaging enough for Boris Johnson to lose his job? Well, a lot of those MPs sitting on, the members of Parliament sitting on those benches, particularly within Boris Johnson's own party, will be reading this report and trying to assess what the British public will say.
Okay.
Now, the report talks about, Hallie, the excessive consumption of alcohol. Translation, allegations that basically people were drunk in Downing Street. People were drunk, and that's not great. That's not great from a PR point of view. So Boris Johnson is not free yet, but I would say predictions of his demise are not becoming true yet, if you like.
So talk to me. You said something important, Kira, which was the way the British public responds to this, right? Because, as our American viewers will know, it's very similar in a political scandal here happens. Occasionally, depending on the public outrage, kind of factors into however the politician will deal with it. I know it's late where you are. I don't have a clock with me. It's like, 11? It's like late night. This report's been out like most of the day.
10:30, 10:30. Half past 10, as we say on this side of the pond.
Oh, Keir, thank you.
10.
What has been the reaction today since this thing dropped?
Well, those reactions in Parliament, around the country, you watch people kind of say, yeah, we're not surprised, laugh a little. You know how politics is there right now, kind of upside down? It's a bit like that here. It's hard to predict, actually, whether people are going to really hold this against Boris Johnson if he manages to get to the next election. But there is a lot to happen before then, Hallie, in particular this police investigation. And how about this? One of the parties that is mentioned in this report that is being investigated by the British police, by Scotland Yard, is in the Prime Minister's own apartment, his own private flat in Downing Street. Pretty difficult to argue that's a work meeting, though even his apartment in Downing Street is a kind of quasi-public and private space. But we'll see what the police make of it. One allegation in the House of Parliament today was that the Prime Minister himself is effectively subject to a criminal investigation. I mean, if that's the case, and the police are not being very open about exactly what they're looking at and what they're thinking of doing. But if that is the case, again, I mean, that has to be politically damaging.
Yeah. You talk about how there's still a lot that's happening, right, between now and when he may be up for election again. Part of it here is what we talked about just a couple minutes ago in the show, which are, for example, tensions with Russia, Ukraine. We know that he had scheduled this phone call, Vladimir Putin, to talk about that. He's supposed to visit Kyiv tomorrow. I mean, it feels like some of the strategy is, and we see this in American politics too, keep doing the day job, hope that the scandal blows over.
Yeah, but today there were reports that he was going to have a phone call with President Putin, and that phone call then didn't happen. Downing Street, according to reports, is saying that they were still busy scheduling it. The suspicion amongst some is, of course, that he had to cancel it or shift it because he had to go and explain himself to his own members of Parliament, to the House of Commons. As you say, he heads for Ukraine tomorrow. It surely must be distracting. The Prime Minister wants us all to believe that he's able to keep doing the day job while people investigate what was going on at night at Downing Street. Whether that's really the case. And then, of course, there's the question, again, of his competence. This is the leader of the country who writes the rules being accused of breaking the rules. The leader of the country who passes the laws being accused of breaking the law. It is a very, very difficult argument for Downing Street to make, that they can just keep going. But that is the argument they are trying to make. Someone like President Putin, he must be watching with a smirk, Hallie.
Keir Simmons, live for us at now half past 10, 10:33 in London. Thank you so much, Keir. I appreciate you being with us to take it. Thanks. Still ahead. Some historically black colleges and universities woke up to bomb threats this morning. Now police are investigating. We've got more details coming up in the 5 Things. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, so many people tonight are remembering the life of former Miss USA Cheslie Kryst, who apparently died by suicide yesterday. The 30-year-old was also a correspondent for Extra. In a statement, her family said she inspired others around the world through her, quote, beauty and strength. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline on your screen now. There is help. There are resources. That's 1-800-273-TALK. Number 2, at least 6 historically black colleges and universities got bomb threats earlier today, triggering some campus lockdowns. Police are looking into this, but here's the deal. This is the second time this month that several HBCUs faced bomb threats. We don't know if these 2 rounds are connected. Police are looking into that. Number 3, there is chaos at the Canadian border because of protests by truckers over COVID mandates. This whole thing originally started from a group called the Freedom Convoy. And Ottawa police say they've been causing traffic, noise, and safety issues. They are protesting some of the vaccine requirement rules. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced he and 2 of his kids are COVID positive meantime and quarantining, and said the protests are an insult to truth. Number 4, a graphic novel about the Holocaust is at the very top of Amazon's bestseller list after a Tennessee school board banned it from its curriculum earlier this month. School officials say they didn't want students reading the book Mouse over what they called vulgar words and inappropriate subjects, but that is a move that's been criticized around the country. The book won a Pulitzer Prize in 1992 and again, number 1 on the charts today. And number 5, Rihanna and A$AP Rocky. Well, there she is. She's rocking a look that I often rock. It's called top 2 buttons done, belly out, bump out, because Rihanna is pregnant. They're expecting their first child together. It seems she showed off that baby bump in these photos. If you haven't seen these pics by now, get yourself on social media. The celebrity photographer Diggsy seemed to confirm the whole thing when he shared the caption, "She is." That's all he said. She clearly is, and that is such exciting news for Riri. Just in now, from our Capitol Hill team, NBC News is learning a key member of the Trump White House has testified in front of the House January 6th committee. We're talking about Mark Short, the former chief of staff to former Vice President Mike Pence. We had reported last month that Short appeared to be cooperating with the committee after having been subpoenaed, and that they were assessing what information he could provide. NBC News has reached out to the committee, but no comment yet. In the last 30 minutes, we just heard from the FBI on a story brewing out of Georgia. A prosecutor out of Atlanta investigating former President Donald Trump for possible election interference, now calling on the agency to keep her and her staff safe. This is happening down in Fulton County, where the district attorney, Fani Willis, says she's really concerned by what the former president said at a rally over the weekend, where he called the prosecutors investigating him, quote, racist, sick, and vicious people. Mr. Trump also told his supporters they should hold the biggest protest we've ever had in cities like Atlanta. Again, that is not a random selection there, Fulton County. That's where this DA is. Her letter in part says, my staff and I will not be influenced or intimidated by anyone. I want to bring in national security correspondent Ken Delaney in. So, Ken, you know, this DA says she was already worried about security even before this rally. Now she's got the former president who's specifically calling out her and her staff. She wants the FBI's backup, basically.
That's right. And after declining to comment all day, the FBI's Atlanta field office, Hallie, just issued a statement saying they are gathering information about potential threats against the DA's office or the courthouse. I'll read it to you. It says the FBI supports our state, local, and federal law enforcement partners while maintaining public safety in the communities we serve. Our efforts are focused on identifying, investigating, and disrupting individuals who are inciting violence and engaging in criminal activity. As we do in the normal course of business, we are gathering information to identify any potential threats and are sharing that information with our partners.
So wait a second.
Translate that a little bit?
Yeah. So because I hear that and I say, okay, well, no, that's no commitment to saying, yeah, we'll give her the extra security, right? That just says we're looking into it.
Right. What I've been hearing privately is, look, we're not the Federal Bureau of Security. That the U.S. Marshals protects courthouses. We will investigate criminal threats. But I have to say, Hallie, this is incredibly serious. FBI and DHS officials have told Congress that this kind of rhetoric, the kind that Trump engaged in, is dangerous and inflammatory and could lead to violence. He's essentially painted a target on the backs of these three prosecutors, as you said, calling them mentally sick and vicious, horrible people. All it takes is one disturbed individual to take that to heart. We already saw on January 6th that there are a group of people ready to do violence when Trump talks like that. So this is a threat that these officials say they have to take seriously.
It's not just attacks on the Fulton County District Attorney, right? Because former President Trump was attacking the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, the Manhattan District Attorney as well, calling them racists. We should note that all three of these prosecutors are black. The Fulton County DA is basically saying, look, he's saying this stuff in front of big crowds. It's being broadcast to a lot of people. And we saw what happened the last time he said things that weren't true to big crowds of people and called for, protests.
That is absolutely right, and that's why people are very concerned about this. You could read her letter as political posturing. Is she making too big a deal? Not when Donald Trump is concerned, because we saw what happened on January 6th.
Speaking of January 6th, we also heard former President Trump say he would consider pardoning people who were convicted or who were behind bars for what happened during the insurrection. And what seemed to me, Ken, as somebody who's covered him for a long time, a very clear way to try to supercharge his base about the possibility of a 2024 run. I want to play a little bit of that.
If I run and if I win, we will treat those people from January 6th fairly. We will treat them fairly. And if it requires pardons, we will give them pardons.
And I think, Ken, that this speaks to some of the commentary that you hear from sort of the very conservative circles who have framed it as these January 6th people being, quote unquote, political prisoners. Former President Trump seems to be trying to tap into that.
Absolutely. And Democrats and independents, as you can imagine, are reacting with outrage to this. And a few Republicans who happened to be in front of television cameras this weekend, including Senator Lindsey Graham, offered tepid disapproval. But most Republicans have been silent, as usual. So even though, there's some polling and some analysis out there suggesting Trump may be losing his grip on the Republican Party, the fact that more senior Republicans haven't condemned these remarks is pretty telling. Because, as you said, they know that a significant chunk of their base has bought into a narrative that the January 6th defendants have somehow been persecuted by the justice system, when, in fact, what's happened is they've been prosecuted for violating federal law.
And just to put a finer point on your excellent assertion there, listen, Donald Trump is still probably the most popular person in the Republican Party right now, but you have now more Republicans, according to our recent polling, who say they are GOP first, not Trump first, right? They're loyal to the party versus the man, which is a complete inversion of what we saw just a year ago. So another data point to look at. Ken Delaney, thank you. Appreciate your reporting.
Thanks, Hallie.
Still to come, 2 Connecticut detectives placed on leave over how they handled the deaths of 2 black women. We've got more on what the Bridgeport mayor has to say about this in the local. And if you're seeing a lot of news about crypto in the headlines lately, but have no idea if you should get in on it, we're going to explain what it is, how it works, and why we can't stop talking about it next. We're answering the questions you want answered about what to know on cryptocurrency, including why one economist is comparing the digital market to the mortgage meltdown of the late 2000s. Jake Ward has more for us in a sec, but first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Northeast Bureau, 2 Connecticut detectives are on administrative leave over how they handled the investigations in the deaths of 2 black women, Lauren Smith-Fields and Brenda Lee Rawls. They both died December 12th in the city of Bridgeport. Their families claim the police department was racially insensitive, while the mayor said he's disappointed with the leadership there. Also out of our Northeast Bureau, New Yorkers can now get free same-day oral antiviral pills delivered to their homes if they get COVID to try to fight the symptoms. Mayor Eric Adams says the goal is to get a handle on the Omicron variant and try to keep people out of the hospital. The pills are being prioritized for people who test positive and who are at higher risk for getting very, very sick, so maybe like a pre-existing condition. And from our West Coast Bureau, the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health is warning people don't swim or surf or play at a handful of different beaches in the area because of so much bacteria in the water. They're blaming the heavy rain, and they want people to stay out until levels are tested again. All right. time to talk cryptocurrency, because maybe you're invested. Maybe you just heard about it from all the ads you've been seeing, or maybe you don't want to touch it. As many questions exist as there are different kinds of crypto, thousands at this point. And one thing we know for sure, it's very volatile. In fact, just this month, the value of cryptocurrencies around the world tanked about $500 billion. So what's going on? Check it out.
These days, cryptocurrency is going mainstream.
Fortune favors the brave.
Stars like Matt Damon, Paris Hilton, Megan Thee Stallion, all pushing crypto in sponsorships.
Hey, hotties, let's talk about Bitcoin.
So what is it? Think about crypto like it's part money, part investment vehicle, and all virtual. Kind of like when you buy things using a credit card. You don't ever see your cash. It's all just digital entries. But crypto cuts out the middlemen, like governments and banks, and replaces them with a decentralized digital ledger, basically a piece of technology that issues the crypto and logs its transactions. And it's global. No need to figure out an exchange rate between, say, American money to euros. Supporters say it can be safer because it uses tech to hide their identities and their balances. And they point out there's no single point of failure in its system, unlike with banks or credit card companies that are centralized by governments. But without a government or bank in control, if you lose your password or get hacked, you're probably not getting your money back. Most people buy crypto hoping it becomes the next big thing, shoots up in value, then suddenly their crypto would be worth a lot more money, at which point they could spend it or trade it for more dollars than they bought it for. Right now, companies from PayPal to Overstock.com, even Home Depot, accept certain forms of cryptocurrency. But because its price is so volatile, the whole thing can be tricky, since people may be less likely to use crypto like cash if they're not sure whether its value will surge or crash.
And that's what we've been seeing here, right? People see both sides of the crypto coin. You've got one notable economist, Paul Krugman, writing in the New York Times recently that this reminds him of the subprime mortgage crisis in the late 2000s. Remember that? That's when banks gave loans to high-risk buyers during a really hot housing market. But then the market turned, the bills came due, homeowners couldn't pay up. That's what was behind the housing market crash. I want to bring in NBC's Jake Ward, who's with us here. Let me start there, Jake, because Krugman's been getting a lot of attention for this comparison here. And there are people who have some quibbles with the way that he is making this metaphor, if you will. Walk us through, how you see it, because I think the point that it seems like he's trying to make, that some critics of crypto will say, is like there are certain people who are seeing these ads, seeing these sponsorships and going, hey, sure, it's like going to the casino, I'll throw in some money and make a ton. But they could get really hurt here.
That's absolutely right, Hallie. The thing about Paul Krugman, right, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, it turns out it takes somebody like that to make a comparison that we can really understand. And in this case, it's comparing it to the subprime mortgage market, in which basically banks sort of packaged up some very risky bets in the real estate business and sold them to the larger market. And that incentivized people to try to sign people up for mortgages that they could not afford. Now, one really interesting point that Krugman makes that I think is really important to make here is that at the time, the subprime mortgage market was basically sold in part as a way to empower people who can't typically buy a home. Unfortunately, when the bottom fell out of that market, it fell hardest on those people. And here he says the same kind of thing is happening, because typically when you look, Hallie, at people who buy stocks, it is educated white men for the most part. In this case, it's really interesting to look at the statistics around who is trading in cryptocurrencies. Those statistics suggest that the average age is under 40. More than half of those people do not have a college degree. A lot of them have a household income under $60,000. And this is the really interesting one, 44% of them are not white. So there has been a huge amount of talk, and I hear it from very smart people close to me who say there's a way of empowering people who have missed out on these opportunities in the past. But what Krugman is saying here is that when these numbers fall out, they're falling out on people who may in fact not have been empowered by this, but may have in fact been preyed on by it. And I think that's a very smart comparison he's making.
I wonder how much this recent crypto crash, right, is going to play into this, Jake, because I think about how easy it is to go on like Reddit, right? And you're looking at these unbelievable stories of people who have made a ton of money in crypto, and it seems very appealing, right? It seems incredibly attractive to get involved with. You've got sports stars, Odell Beckham Jr., others like Aaron Rodgers, right, who promote crypto, promote Bitcoin by getting their salaries in crypto. Then you see this crash, right? The value has sunk from a high of something like $69,000 to $38,000 today. That ain't great, right? Look at that, those two camel humps there. You don't want to see the lines going down. You want to see them going up if you have crypto. Do you think this is going to be kind of a reality check for folks on that front?
Well, I think what's really interesting here, right, is that we are falling prey to a classic thing that psychologists would point out, which is called survivorship bias. You only hear the stories of people who've made money. You almost never hear stories about people who, lost everything to something like this. And so that's a really big one. So when somebody like Odell Beckham or Aaron Rodgers, takes a portion of their salary in crypto, we all think, well, that person is a superhuman millionaire. I'm absolutely going to follow what they do. But I think this is the thing is, it doesn't matter if you're a Nobel Prize winning economist or a superhuman millionaire, you are not qualified to really figure out what this stuff is worth. As all economists agree, it is impossible to understand where this is going because it is totally fictional. Crypto is not based on anything. There are no actual materials that go into it. At least with the housing market, we know how many people build houses, right? We can track the price of lumber. With crypto, we are literally making it up as we go along. And so it is an economist, a football player, or a television journalist, it's our best guess as to where this thing is going. And right now it is certainly going the wrong direction, Hallie.
Jake Ward, it is great to have you on to break that down. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being with us. Up next, Joe Rogan, podcast host extraordinaire, or infamous, I should say, or famous, depending how you see him. He's responding to the controversy over Spotify after Neil Young and some other people say they wanted their music off the platform because of COVID misinformation. Rogan and Spotify say they'll do better, and they have about 100 million reasons to promise that. Ben Collins explains. Coming up. Joe Rogan and Spotify doing damage control on the controversy around his podcast and its role in spreading COVID misinformation, with Rogan posting a video to his Instagram saying he'll try to do better. Watch.
I'm not trying to promote misinformation. I'm not trying to be controversial. I've never tried to do anything with this podcast other than just talk to people and have interesting conversations.
That statement from Rogan came, of course, after something we told you about a few days ago, when Neil Young first raised up the issue of COVID misinformation on Rogan's podcast. Young basically said to Spotify, it's either him or me, because he was so concerned about that misinformation. Spotify said, okay, Joe Rogan it is, essentially, although they've been saying positive, complimentary things to Neil Young regardless. Spotify is also out with a new statement saying they're adding a content advisory to any podcast that talks about COVID. But they also defended their role in this whole thing, saying we have a critical role to play in supporting creator expression, adding it's important we don't take on the position of being a content censor. So Rogan hasn't been deplatformed. He's still making $100 million in this contract with Spotify. And the company has lost a couple of $1 billion in value since Neil Young raised this whole thing. Ben Collins is on the story again for us tonight. So, Ben, here's the interesting thing here. Looking broadly at this, right? We've got the. Let me start micro, then we'll go macro. Start with the Joe Rogan apology here. Was it surprising to you? I spoke with Kara Swisher, who folks who watch this network, know, a podcast host herself, who said she was actually surprised that Rogan was so sort of, complete in talking about this and promising to do better. She thought he didn't need to go that far, and he did. What did you think?
I think he probably got a phone call from somebody at Spotify. It was like, I think you should be a little bit more complete than usual this time. I think that's probably just what happened here, Hallie. But look, he has always played the, I'm just some dumb guy with a podcast. I watch people hit each other in the head for a living on the side. So that's his thing. And look, God bless him. That is true. That is absolutely true. He is a guy with a podcast. He just happens to make $100 million from, the largest streaming service globally. So it's complicated. Hallie, I think a really interesting thing here to talk about. By the way, I just activated Siri by talking to this, so we're going to see what happens with my headphones in a second.
Power through, Ben. You got this.
The interesting thing to talk about here is Joe Rogan developed a very specific audience from YouTube that he brought over to Spotify. And he started catering to that audience over time. It was an algorithmically tailored audience completely by mistake. And people in alt-right circles from 2015 to 2018 were finding their way to Joe Rogan on the second or third autoplay video after pretty much any video that you would see from the alt-right. I don't think Joe Rogan had a lot to do with this. I don't think his producers did. I think he was just the beneficiary of that pipeline. And from there, he had to serve that audience. He brought that audience with him to Spotify. So, if the algorithm was bringing people from science videos to him, I'm sure he would have had more doctors on in the last few years. But instead, we have the Alex Jones types and the people who, claim to be banned from the medical establishment, because that's what the YouTube algorithm preferred before he went to Spotify.
What's also interesting here, Ben, and you make a really important point, is that YouTube, Facebook, some of these other sites, they see themselves as platforms. It feels like Spotify wants to see itself as a platform, but it is actually perhaps a content creator because they're paying Joe Rogan to make this content. So it almost feels a little bit, and listen, you tell me, but it almost feels a little bit like Spotify wants to have the protections of a platform, but make the money of a content creator.
You know, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube have a lot easier time making that case because they largely neutrally host content. They largely don't pay the people who post content on their services. They're paying this guy $100 million. They're a lot closer to, say, like Netflix or us or NBC, right? Than they are to Facebook. They are a company that now buys out talent and puts their stuff in their catalog on their network. So they're making a lot more of a conscious choice here than, say, YouTube or Facebook is. And I think that's why the backlash is like this. And I think it's why you're seeing this sort of superseding backlash from all these other creators who are saying, like, 10 million people listened to my songs last month, and I just got a check for $60. Like, is this really fair? This guy got, $100 million for having on the guy from the anti-vax rally, and people genuinely love my songs, and I'm not hurting anybody, and I'm getting $60. And I think that's why you're seeing this larger business, kerfuffle going on right now.
I doubt it is the last time we'll talk about this kind of larger business kerfuffle on this show. Ben Collins, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching us. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.